It's Tuesday, the 11th of October. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Tim Loughton, Labour MP Chris Bryant, Sonia Sodha, Chief Leader Writer at The Observer, and Natasha Clark, Chief Political Correspondent at The Sun. Today, MPs return to the Commons, but will Liz Truss keep them on side over spending cuts?
Can £60 billion worth of cuts be found?
After a series of U-turns, has the Chancellor done enough to reassure the markets?
What the Prime Minister and Chancellor are being very clear about is that we do need to grow our economy.
They're going to have to revisit more of this because ministers have got themselves into a real mess here.
Liz Truss faces another battle, this time over free school meals.
What we have now is a situation where kids are coming with nothing. They've got nothing on their card, they've got nothing even in a lunchbox.
As more countries choose to decriminalise cannabis, could the UK go the other way? Also, the cost of living crisis hits those reliant on heating oil.
People living in rural areas are at the bottom of the pile. We are forgotten about.
You heard Jamie Oliver there in the headlines. He says he's prepared to take on Liz Truss over expanding the eligibility of primary school children in England for free school meals. Do you agree with Jamie Oliver, Tim?
I don't, as it stands at the moment, and I was one who rebelled against the government on free school meals when it was an issue during the pandemic. What the government has done is a massive expansion of the Holiday Activities Club, which is not just about giving meals to kids, but it's about providing activities and exercise and mentoring and all sorts of other things, which has been hugely successful. I visited several schemes over the summer. We've put a lot of money into that. If in addition we now upgrade benefits in line with inflation, as many of us want to do, and I think now the Prime Minister is going to be doing that. That is, again, giving some additional money. It's not going to be easy. We know just how big an issue the cost of living crisis is across many families. But I think giving just free school meals to everybody, many of whom don't need it, necessarily, rather than targeting it, as the government has been, is not the best use of scarce resources at the moment.
Do you agree with Jamie Oliver, Chris? Therese Coffey, the Health Secretary, hit back, countered what he's calling for, which is quite a big expansion for families on universal credit, maybe not all families on universal credit. She said there were many families who would be benefiting who could be earning up to £40,000 a year. Is that the best way to use money?
I heard her on the radio this morning. It was one of the grumpiest interviews I've heard her do. And she kept on saying it's none of my business because it's up to the Education Secretary. Look, I mean, the fundamental point is that kids who have a full stomach and haven't just had, a fizzy drink before they came into school are likely to do better in school. And we know that that is the foundations of a strong economy. Actually, if you want to grow the economy for the next 20 years, you need kids to be doing better in school.
But should it be expanded to everyone on universal credit? I'm
not sure about everybody, but it should certainly go up higher. I haven't done the maths, but we have a more generous scheme in Wales at the moment under a Labour government, which I think is a good idea.
Well, I think it's going to be expanded in 2024, isn't it, to all primary schools?
That's what we're doing, yes.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, of course, you've got to keep this going through the vacations, through the holidays, because I know I represent one of the poorest constituencies in the land. There will be families who will be making very, very, very tough decisions. And if those kids don't prosper in their early years, they don't stand a chance.
Is Jamie Oliver right to take on this battle with Liz Truss, or is Tim correct saying it should be more targeted, any expansion?
I think Jamie Oliver is right. At the moment, free school meals is limited only to parents on the very, very lowest incomes. There are many more parents who are struggling to feed their kids at the moment. I agree with Chris. It's better for educational attainment and closing the gap between poorer and richer kids. But it's also really good in terms of saving the NHS money because it would have knock-on impacts on obesity. I disagree with Tim, actually. I think that I probably wouldn't do it for everyone because I think there are better uses of money. But I don't think the government has been government spending anywhere near enough on closing the gap between children from more and less affluent backgrounds in the wake of the pandemic. And actually, the government's education recoveries are resigned because the government was only spending a fraction of what he said needed to be spent. So we need to see much more from the government on catch-up tuition than we've seen.
Natasha, do you think Liz Truss will give in on this?
It's a problem for her, isn't it? Because obviously we've seen this with the benefits uplift and inflation. Obviously, now that MPs are seeing exactly how much money is being spent on tax cuts, naturally other MPs are going to be looking, well, actually, what are you going to be doing to help the poorest? And that's a completely fair argument to have. You know, some people will say this policy to extend free school meals won't actually cost that much. This report from the Free Food Foundation, I think it was today, is really interesting because it looks at the economic benefits. And obviously it's a nice way for Jamie Oliver to say, actually, you know what, you want to talk about growth? Let's talk about growth. And I think that, you know, the argument for that, you know, is completely fair. It's only going to be cost a few £1 million per year, but can have a big economic benefit.
All right, well, let's have a look at some of the difficult choices ahead. Tim, you mentioned the decision coming down the line in terms of uprating benefits either in line with inflation or with earnings. Now, this is the Prime Minister today had her second only cabinet meeting since she was Prime Minister and the first one since the chaotic Conservative Party conference. We might be able to show you some pictures of the cabinet. Well, there, in fact, is Therese Coffey. We were just talking about her, former Work and Pension Secretary, now the Health Secretary and de facto Deputy Prime Minister, and Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Business Secretary, all arriving there for that meeting. But first of all, you weren't at conference, were you, Tim?
No, that's why I'm so chilled at the moment.
Oh, yes, where were you?
Frozen.
I was in the Arctic Circle, on a boat, mostly without Wi-Fi, which is absolute bliss, and I can really recommend it. Not having social media access, not having torrents of WhatsApp groups saying what's going on, and not having loads of emails is very therapeutic.
But now you're back. It's the first day back in the Commons. What is the mood like? Now you will have heard about Michael Gove's assault on the 45p tax rate policy that was then dropped. Grant Shapps, another former Cabinet Minister, saying that Liz Truss had 10 days to sort things out. More backroom briefing than I have ever seen in recent years at a Tory party conference.
Yes, and thank goodness I was no part of it last week. And one of the first conferences I've missed in years, having been to party conference since the age of 15, which was quite a long time ago now. It is the first day back. There's lots of fractious colleagues needing some quite serious reassurance from Number 10 and the Chancellor that they've got a grip on this, that they understand there are some serious concerns amongst Conservative MPs on behalf of our constituents as well. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I did a street surgery on Saturday in my constituency, as I do most Saturday mornings, and quite a lot of people coming up to me with knowing looks. And the question was, you know, well, what is going on? But I think the real problem here is she's got off to a not really good start, and that sets the tone. That's probably putting it mildly. So now we're on the back foot and playing defence and catch-up. The shame is that in the financial statement, mini-budget, whatever you want to call it, there were some really good things. And the stuff about tax cutting, the real serious issues around energy bills that we're addressing, and a huge package there, good news, overshadowed by something that financially is very small, but was politically completely the wrong thing to do in terms of the cutting the high rate tax rate as well. And that's what's overshadowed it, as well as a few other things.
And Chris, I'll come to you in just a moment. Now, let me just show you this headline then in the Times in terms of having to reassure MPs and voters. Liz Truss must find £60 billion in savings to balance the books, warns the think tank. This is the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who say on the back of those unfunded tax cuts, in order to balance the books, they are suggesting there'll have to be £60 billion worth of savings and cuts to spending from government departments. Can they be found?
Well, we don't know if that's going to be necessary. There are an awful lot of imponderables at the moment. For example, the fall in wholesale gas prices will mean, if it continues on that track, that the amount of money needed to put into the energy cap support will be much less. Against that, you've got the rise in gilt yields, which means the cost of government borrowing will go up. There's a whole lot of imponderables. So the Chancellor's got a really difficult equation to balance. And he needs to show to the financial markets, to the city and to people in Parliament that his figures do add up and do balance. And that's why he's brought forward that statement at the end of this month now.
You were pulling a face there, Chris, when Tim was talking about the mini-budget, that there were lots of good things, says Tim. And, of course, there were, because Labour agreed with quite a few of them in terms of the reversal of the national insurance contribution rise, which, of course, you're going to be voting on later today. You would agree that it wasn't all gloom?
The point is, this is all far too late. We should have been addressing the cost of living crisis back in February, March, April, but the Prime Minister at the time was poo-pooing the idea that inflation was going to be an issue. And then we had the Tory shenanigans, you know, a new leader and all the rest of it, so we had months of not doing anything. It's all far too late. And then they basically put everything on red, and it came up black. They spooked the markets. We've had to spend £65 billion on trying to sort out that. We're going to have...
We haven't.
Just
That's absolute rubbish.
The Bank of England has intervened and is intervening again, but we haven't.
And they're frightened because and everything that we know is happening now means that mortgage rates are going to go up very, very dramatically. So if you have to take out a new mortgage or if you have to renew your mortgage in the next few months, you will be seeing it going up. One of my members of staff told me today hers will be going up possibly £300 a month. That's money people simply haven't got. And that is a crisis manufactured in Downing Street because these were uncosted. Well, the package... Tim, just let me, please, if you don't mind.
Well, go on, finish your sentence.
Because they came forward with uncosted tax cuts and without a proper OBR statement, which means that the markets were spooked.
Right.
And that means that the mortgage increases are entirely at their doorstep. And what really worries me, my local authority is already £47 million in problems for next year. If they closed every single voluntary service, that wouldn't even touch the sides of that. There'll be cuts in policing, there'll be cuts...
All right, we'll come on to the spending cuts in a moment, because I want to go back to the point that actually Labour does support quite a few of the key measures. But, Tim, do you want to respond?
Yeah, because we can trot out all these sound bites which Labour are coming up with, but we need to have some facts as well. So what isn't a fact is that the government has had to spend £65 billion on supporting the gilt markets. What has actually happened is that the Bank of England said it would have a facility of up to £65 billion to intervene to buy gilts, not just throw money at it. In fact, in the first few weeks, it spent £2 billion.
But the Bank of England had to step in because the government was so irresponsible...
Don't interrupt me. To the tune of £2 billion, not £65 billion. Now, that, I'm afraid, also, let's look at some of your figures as to what Labour would have done about it. It's all going to be in the windfall tax. £170 billion, apparently, of energy profits can be taxed. It's complete nonsense.
Good try.
That's the worldwide energy company's profits, not just in the UK.
Some of the profits are actually in Russia because it's British money going into the Russian economy, which would probably be a good idea to stop as well.
Labour's figures don't add up and it's scare stories, so what would they do?
All right, government came to the House of Commons with a package which it knew didn't add up, and you know that, Tim, as well as anybody else. When you get out of this studio, you'll be telling everybody privately how you have no confidence in this government's financial situation. You should say it on television today.
Do you have confidence in Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng?
Yes, and I want to see... It's not just me that needs to be convinced, it's the financial markets and everybody else, and that's why we've got to have...
They're not convinced,
and that's why we've got to have a very comprehensive statement at the end of this month, which shows where the figures are coming from.
When he came to the House of Commons.
Well, all right, well, hang on.
You're saying we've got to do something urgently. Now you're saying, oh, actually, it should have taken
Let me bring in our other guests. I mean, Sonia, the truth is that Labour does support some of the key measures that were there, most notably reversing the rise in national insurance contributions. That was Liz Truss's #1 policy, probably, during the leadership campaign, costing £18 billion. They reversed the 45p tax rate policy, and they agree with the energy intervention. That may cost slightly less, as Tim was saying, than we first thought. So on a lot of these issues, Labour support the government.
I think Labour's in a slightly tricky position, actually, on the tax cuts. I mean, the energy package, let's face it, everyone agrees something needed to be done and the markets were expecting it. I think there's a question when you take a step back and put the politics to one side. Is it a good idea to do very expensive, across-the-board tax cuts right now, with the economy in the state that it is, doing this very big energy package? And I think it It isn't really, and I think most people would probably agree with that, because that implies, as the IFS has said, the need for spending cuts. And after a decade of austerity, the NHS is on its knees after a pandemic, a 2-year global pandemic. Schools are saying some of us may not be financially viable. You've got nursery providers who say that they may have to close. This is not the time for further spending cuts. The network of public services just cannot take it. So I think it's the wrong time to be cutting taxes. We should be doing targeted support to people who need it the most.
Can they balance the books, Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss, Natasha?
Doesn't look great according to the IFS stuff today, does it? But at the end of the day, I think, full credit to Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng for at least trying something different. We've had, rates of slow growth for years and years and years. It hasn't worked. They're trying something different. And, I think Labour's plan...
Sorry.
No, it hasn't, has it? Labour's plans, how would that be different?
Labour's plans have never been put to the test, though, since... So, I mean, we actually have very high growth.
I'll tell you a way of testing what the British public want, whether they want our plans or Conservative plans. Let's have a general election.
Have you been put on a general election?
We have been put on a general election.
What's Keir Starmer actually said to you, to MPs?
He's not said anything to me personally, so I don't know. All I've read is what's available through the wonderful journalists who've been told about it. As I understand it, we're moving our office. We're on. But the bigger point surely is, if there is a contest between even Nadine Dorries says that what Liz Truss is doing at the moment has no mandate from the British people. It's just a punt. It's just a guess. It's on a hunch. And already the markets have been spooked. So let's have a proper general election. We'll lay out our plans. You can lay out your plans. The reason, incidentally, on national insurance contributions that we're supporting it being removed today is for a very simple reason. Yes, because it's been published. Because we were always against imposing them in the first place.
But that is one of the key
You voted to put them in, and now you're going to vote against what you did earlier on this year.
Tim, what do you say to the MPs like Michael Gove and Grant Shapps and you yourself, who are going to pressurise the government into uprating benefits in line with inflation? Is it the case, Natasha says, that Liz Truss is actually trying something new, hamstrung by MPs like you?
Well, the first thing I'd say to people like Michael Gove and Grant Shapps is probably take a holiday, and I can recommend the Arctic for that. I do not think that it is feasible not to uprate benefits in line with inflation at the moment. So I and many of my colleagues have said that quite forcefully, and it looks as though Number 10 has listened, and that is what will now happen.
Have you been told that?
No, we haven't been told that, but all the mood music is going that way. And if that doesn't happen, I think there will be a problem with people like me.
Would you vote against if they don't uprate? Will you vote against?
People are well, I have form in voting against my government in the past, but it's not going to come to that. People are seriously suffering at the moment, which is why the package for the energy cap, the largest of any country in Europe, was so significant, but it is the largest of any country.
I think Germany's was bigger.
Not when you work it up for those people who have benefited from it most. Anyway, it is really, really big. That is a good start. It's still not enough. And given that benefits were only uprated by 3.1%, I think it was in April, because it's September before that dictates it, there's some serious catch-up to do. So I think that has to happen, just as pensioners absolutely have to have their uprating, as they will, I understand, as well.
I mean, just briefly, Chris, I'm going to show you this borrowing forecast because, again, it's from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. If you look at 24, 25, 25, 26, it's still at £100 billion. Labour win the election whenever that is. You'll have to deal with that. How will you?
It's going to be very tough. And it looks as if, basically, the government has crashed the economy. And I can't see that 2 years more of this under Liz Truss is sustainable. I mean, it may be that 2 months isn't sustainable.
But how would you... So what are the tough choices you'd make?
We shouldn't be doing the tax, the major tax cuts that the government's still wanting to proceed in. We may have to do more. I think Tim is absolutely right. You cannot make the poorest people in society pay for this by not having an upgrading.
Promising tax rises?
No. The honest truth is, if we had a general election now, we would have to lay down all our plans on the table.
So what are they? You've been put on election footing. How would you do it differently?
Well, I would undo I personally would undo all the elements of what was in the mini budget because it has spooked the market. Well, all of them. I've just said I would undo not only the. You seem to be entirely focused on the one issue, which is the corporation tax of the bankers' bonuses and so on. But I think all of these measures need to be reviewed. You need to have a responsible government. I think Rachel Reeves is far more respected than Kwasi Kwarteng by the markets at the moment. All the polling suggests that the Labour Party is people are more confident in the Labour Party. But let's have a general election and fight it out.
But the thing is, hang on to the evidence there is that they've done things like they've tried to, or they have, in fact, announced that James Bowler, someone who is very much entrenched in Whitehall orthodoxy, they've tried to undo some of the things that they tried to do, and still the markets are putting up government borrowing. So when Chris says Rachel Reeves would be more trusted than Kwasi Kwarteng, she got a point. He got a point.
Well, markets move up and down, and a lot of the changes...
They're doing a lot of moving down,
and they've been doing a lot of moving down, but they've gone back up against the dollar. And also, look at it in international context. The fall in stock markets in the US, for example, has been much more than in the UK. The fall in the value of the Japanese yen against the dollar has been much more than it has for the pound.
So you look at this growth in the UK is still down compared to G7.
Which is absolutely why we've got to try it.
All right,
the biggest issue is going to be people's mortgages.
We've got to try it a different way. And if you think, Chris, having criticised the delay over the last couple of months, and now you're saying, we must have a general election, so another couple of months of electioneering and away from getting on with the serious business of the government. When we've got a government that has a majority and can get on with the business of government.
It's not got a majority for
it hasn't got a majority. It's not even got you on its side.
We have a clear majority of getting stuff through
although is
Parliament.
Nadine Dorries right that there isn't a mandate for some of the things that they're trying to do?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the 2019 manifesto that the Conservative Party was elected on and what Liz Truss is trying to do, it's a complete about change. This idea of hugely expensive tax cuts, potentially big spending cuts to things like the NHS and education. It's a very, very different agenda. There's no democratic mandate for it.
You've got a completely fair point. And I also just want to point out that Liz Truss in the campaign said, no, I'm not returning to an age of austerity. So I think she's going to have a fight on her hands if she decides to do that.
But equally, she can't get her policies through. She's had 5 policies.
We're going to talk about all of those things over the coming weeks. I just want to point you to this story. Well, you say she's not even going to be here for a couple of weeks. BBC News, Sam Tarry, former Shadow Minister, ousted in deselection vote. This was a deselection in Ilford South, the first deselection of a Labour MP, I think, for over a decade. Good news?
Well, it was a battle fought in the local constituency, and the other candidate, who would have been a candidate when Sam was selected, if he hadn't been suspended for something which turned out to be completely false claims, has won. He got 499 to 356, something like that. So democracy triumphs.
What about the broad church in Labour, Sonia? I mean, is there a risk of this? I mean, MPs, maybe not Chris, but many Labour MPs complained about the threat of deselection under Jeremy Corbyn, but no one was in the end deselected.
No, and you don't see other MPs on the far left sort of at risk of deselection. I think the irony of this is that people in the left of the party are making a huge fuss about it. They're the ones who wanted local democracy. This is local democracy. The members have spoken. I happen to think that Jazz Athwell, the candidate who won this time, was treated absolutely terribly in 2019. There were some horrible, dirty tricks pulled by allies of Sam Tarry. So, local members have reacted to that and had their say.
All right, let's move on. A group of Conservative police and crime commissioners want cannabis to be reclassified as a Class A drug. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, had been considering it and is on the side of those PCCs who are proposing it. Let me just show you this headline in The Guardian. Number 10 rejects, though, the reports that Braverman could make cannabis Class A. Spokesman says no plans to reclassify, despite claims that Home Secretary supports the move. Let's talk to Chris Nelson, Police and Crime Commissioner for Gloucestershire. Hello to you, Chris. You're one of those who would like to see it reclassified. Are you disappointed by the reports that say it won't happen?
Well, we'll have to see what develops. We've got together the commissioners to make a fight against cannabis. Cannabis is proving to be far more serious than people realise. Medical evidence is coming out from around the world about the long-term effects of cannabis, particularly strong cannabis like skunk. We're talking about ageing effects, birth defects, cancer, mental health, psychosis. It's a lot more serious drug than people realise, and we shouldn't really be talking about it as just a bit of weed.
Right. I mean, is there a justification, or what is the justification in your mind for reclassifying it in line with other drugs like heroin and crack?
Well, I think this initiative has achieved our first objective in getting everybody to talk about this subject. We haven't talked seriously about cannabis and the impact of cannabis for quite some time, but since we started this initiative last week, there's been lots of media interest, lots of discussion, and that's exactly what we want. It's a very serious subject. There's lots of different opinions out there, and we just want to do better fighting the illegal drug trade.
Natasha, what do you think your readers will make of this proposal that does seem to have been rejected, according to reports?
I think they'll probably say, well, are the cops enforcing the law as it is? And really, what difference would it make? And obviously, we've got one side of the equation, you know, the Conservatives looking to apparently toughen it up. Well, on the other side of the equation, you've got Sadiq Khan, who wants to bring it down again. So, yeah, very much a live issue. But I think they will say, really, what's the point? Why can't, you know, police be enforcing the laws that we have before we even think about changing them?
Well, Chris, what do you say to that?
Well, it's not really about locking people up and throwing the keys away. I think for users, we need to have more diversion, more education, more crime prevention, more drug awareness, courses for addiction, and helping users. It's the drug dealers.
But why can't you do that? Why can't you do that without reclassifying it as a Class A drug?
Well, we can still do that, and no matter what the outcome of this initiative is, we will still continue to work against the drug dealers. And within the Southwest, for instance, there's 5 forces that work together on Op Scorpion against drug dealers. But I think it is important to have this debate, because a lot of people talk about recreational drugs as if taking cannabis is harmless, and it's not.
Right. I mean, isn't that the point, that actually different strands of cannabis, and they do harm, particularly mental health and psychosis, should it be at least looked at?
Of course there are risks, but lots of things that have risks are legalised and are actually made safer through regulation. So I think there's evidence to suggest that if you legalise cannabis, I've been to Washington State where it is legal, you can very tightly regulate what's on sale. You can regulate the amount of psychoactive substances, for example, in products that are allowed to be sold, and it could be safer. I think one really important point, criminalising it further is the wrong direction. One reason for that is the unequal racial impact. So if we look at what happens, actually, if you look in surveys, black people are less likely to say that they take drugs like cannabis, but they are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched in London. And we see the same in the US. It has very unequal racial impacts in terms of who gets criminalised by the criminal justice system. It tends to be middle-class white people who take these drugs, who get away with it, and young black men who end up in prison for it.
Legalising it, as Sonia was saying?
I don't think so. I don't think
oh, hang on. I'll come back to you, Chris, in just a second. Go on, Natasha.
No, I don't think our readers will agree with that at all. I think, you know, that just, you know, gives it you know, the people that argue that it's a gateway drug to harder drugs, completely fair enough, but you know,
is alcohol.
Yeah, completely agreed. But
so would you?
It's slightly different effects and affects the body in slightly different ways.
It does, but the evidence is actually that on a short-term basis, cannabis use is safer than. I mean, there's, you know.
The evidence, to be honest, is very, very mixed.
It is mixed,
especially because cannabis has different effects in different people. So for some people, it increases intraocular pressure, and others it diminishes it. So and historically, I don't think we've done enough research into it. I don't think now is the time to be either legalising or further criminalising it. I think both are, and frankly, I think the Home Secretary should have better things to be getting on with, like dealing with the domestic abuse crisis that we've got in the country. Only 1% of cases leading to any kind of conviction. Lots of cases never even getting to trial. We've got a massive backlog in the courts. Oh, and by the way, the Conservatives cut the number of police by 20,000.
Apart from that last point, I largely agree with Chris. I'm on the Home Affairs Select Committee. We're doing a study into the legal status of drugs at the moment. From all the evidence we've heard so far, cannabis absolutely is a far more serious drug and far more powerful than what people were used to back in the 1960s. I haven't heard a case be made that it should be made more of a criminal offence. The real problem is with fentanyl and some of these artificial drugs, 1,000 times more powerful than heroin, causing serious increases in drug deaths. That's where we need to be concentrating on how we use the law, how we use education, how we use drug treatment centres. We visited a really interesting place. I saw people injecting themselves up in Middlesbrough in a very controlled way. Some really interesting, innovative ways of how we can turn the battle against drugs.
I would say that the evidence that this government is unsustainable is the very fact that we're having this debate at this particular moment, because somebody had to throw some red meat out there into the political circle. Well, the government hasn't got a majority.
It's a non-story.
It speaks to a cabinet where the Home Secretary has a view to a potential leadership election. When you've got very senior cabinet ministers going out and kite flying like this and launching...
That's not the issue.
Hang on, not a pile on.
Serious police commissioners who have got a point, and I'm sure those of us who are MPs, the issue about enforcement is a serious one. I don't necessarily have a problem with limited person use. I do have a problem with the impacts on other people, and the complaints we get about antisocial behaviour of neighbours, the effect on children, are all serious considerations where the law is not working at the moment, and we need enforcement to work before we change the law.
Well, let me get Chris to have a final say. I mean, what do you make of what you've just heard from Tim Loughton, Chris, saying that actually he hasn't really heard an argument or a persuasive argument to actually look at this, that it is kite flying, as Sonia said?
Look at enforcement.
Well, some of the evidence is mixed. That's, I guess, why we're having a debate. But, for instance, if you look in the UK, 30% of our patients that suffer from psychosis are caused by skunk. It is a serious problem. Not everybody who takes cannabis is going to have a problem, but a significant number of people do. And I think legalising it, all the evidence that I've seen is you end up in those countries with more powerful cannabis being available because users become used to a certain strength and want the higher power cannabis. And that's what's leading to the long-term adverse medical impacts.
I mean, Chris, just before we let you go, what about enforcing the current existing laws better?
Yes, we need to do better, and that's why my colleagues in the Southwest are working together to fight against drug dealers. And we've had 2 ops in the last few months and confiscated over 1 million of drugs.
All right, Chris Nelson, thank you very much. Will you have one of these police and crime commissioners before your select committee then?
I think we're due to.
Oh, are you?
Actually, absolutely, yes. And I think they've given us written evidence already.
Let's move on. From the beginning of this month, most people in the UK will be protected in part from soaring bills by a 2-year energy price cap. But consumers who rely on heating oil or liquefied petroleum gas and are technically off-grid aren't protected by a cap. Shelley Phelps has been speaking to people in Wales who are calling on the government to do more.
You can see he's had one coating already.
Cats Tavy Cheesemaker's farmhouse dairy in Llandyssil is not connected to the mains gas. Instead, they rely on LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, to heat their buildings and the water used in this hot tub-sized vat. Over the past year, owner John has seen the per litre cost of filling up his tank rise from 40p to 82p. While his business will benefit from the energy price cap on electricity costs, LPG is not covered.
Making cheese, let's say, in an urban area or in a city, right, I would have the benefit of the price cap of the mains gas and the electricity. But living in a rural area, right, we are disadvantaged.
John has already put up the price of his products to cover rising costs, but fears doing so again risks pricing themselves out of the market.
It does keep me awake at night. Like 22 people. It's not just 22 people, but it's also their families. It's about 40 people that depend for their livelihood on what we do here.
Almost a fifth of households in Wales are not connected to the mains gas grid, many of them in rural areas. In Ceredigion, almost 75% of properties are off-grid, while in Powys and Anglesey, that figure is over half. One fuel supplier headquartered in Carmarthenshire has started providing free oil to its most vulnerable elderly customers.
The elderly especially are struggling. And we hear it every day. People are on the phone, they're losing loved ones, they've lost loved ones with COVID and whatever, and they're desperate. They can't afford the fuel, the way the prices have gone.
In the filling station cafe is 92-year-old Alan, who says he can just about afford his energy costs with help from the scheme and some cutting back.
This coming winter has put a totally different perspective on things. Everybody is going to have to think twice before they actually turn the thermostat up or whatever. And I'm one of those who will be doing just that.
Off-grid homeowners like Alan are getting an extra £100 from the UK government, but rural campaigners say it's a drop in the ocean.
It's nowhere near enough. The £100 doesn't really touch your fuel bill. I mean, we're looking today at fuel, including the VAT, being nearly £1 a litre. Well, it's not going to fill your tank or even half fill your tank.
Back in Llandyssil, John appreciates that designing a support system to cover all the different ways of heating premises is complex, but says the UK government must find a way to square the circle.
Chris, your constituency is semi-rural. Do you have constituents in this position?
Yes, not large numbers, but a few, in particular farmers. And in fact, the farm that I used to have in the Rhondda, I was off-grid as well. And the house where I now live, we went on-grid about 10 years ago. So yes, obviously we've got to deal with this issue in the round. And there are two areas that in addition to this, that I'm worried about. One is, for my constituents, if you're on a very low income and you've gone from spending £1,200 on your energy bill to £2,500 in a year, that is just unsustainable for them. And secondly, for businesses, and I was talking to somebody who runs a leisure chain yesterday, he was saying the fact that they're only protected until April next year is a real problem because
although that was Labour's original proposal, wasn't it? On energy intervention was 6 months.
Well, yeah, I know, but we're the opposition. We're not the... Tim, grow up. We're the opposition, we're not the government. But his bill is going from £100,000 a year to £475,000. He says we will close.
Well, yes. I mean, I can think...
So something's going to have to happen for businesses beyond next April.
I don't know how many of your constituents, Tim, are in this position, but do you think more needs to be done? £100 on top...
No, it does. Although my constituents are mostly urban, I was actually at a prize-giving ceremony, 150 farmers at the weekend. Lots of very rural farmers, lots of rural communities, don't have mains gas, have to rely on much more expensive fuel that aren't covered under some of these schemes. What I want to see, as we did with business grants during the pandemic, is discretionary funds being given to, probably through local authorities, where there are certain people who fall between two stools and can get additional help if they are not being covered. Those discretionary grants actually work really, really well.
No, they don't. They're really problematic for local authorities. I mean, we've been dealing with hundreds and hundreds of them, and the government increasingly makes things into discretionary grants. It means that lots of people feel, for all sorts of complicated reasons, that they shouldn't apply or don't know how to apply, and it ends up being more unfair.
You're not running it properly, because actually for those people who fell between two stools, and there were many like that, particularly in the hospitality industry, they were an absolute lifeline. And my council did an absolute blinder in identifying those businesses and giving them money before they went out of business.
All right, because I'm going to show you some pictures. Have a look at this, and I'll tell you what they're about. It's Just Stop Oil, who are protesting in London throughout October. At the weekend, you can see here motorists dragging protesters off the street. The question is, of course, should the public be taking matters into their own hands? The Queen's speech in May proposed making locking on. That's when protesters actually sort of either glue themselves or lock themselves to various items. After the government failed to pass the measure earlier this year, they want to try and make it a criminal offence. Natasha, is it acceptable that members of the public dragging protesters off, even if they are blocking the roads?
I can understand this frustration completely, and I'm sure our readers can too. You know, these are people trying to get to work. You've not played the clip of an ambulance, which a fire engine, which was earlier trying to get through. I think people are really outraged about that, saying exactly what are the police doing? They're just standing there in many of these pictures, unable to act. And I think, you know, many people will say, what are the government going to do about this?
Where are you, Sonia?
I mean, I agree with Natasha on the frustration, but I would caution any member of the public sort of looking to engage like that, because I think you're putting yourself at risk, of being accused of assault by the protesters. So, I mean, I think we have to be... I mean, I personally don't think those protesters are doing their cause any favours at all. In fact, I think they're turning people off it. But I think we have to be very careful about how we sort of look to police public protest. I think some of that stuff would just, you know, fall under the category of the police are able to move people on anyway. But I think we've got to be very careful.
They don't, do they? They don't move them on. That's the whole point. The whole point is that they're you know, they don't look very stuck there, to be fair. You know, but at the end of the day, you've had people padlocking themselves to things, gluing themselves to things. Police just stand there doing nothing, and it's a bit unclear what powers do they have, can they move them on, and these people are disrupting not just, you know, people getting every day to work, but also vital services in this country like ambulances and fire engines.
Do they need more powers, or do they need to be able to protest more robustly then, Natasha?
I think, you know, at the end of the day, you know, it's quite unclear what the police's powers are in this. I think it would be very helpful for them, I think, to know whether they could or not remove these people, because there is a lot of confusion about what they can and can't do.
I think it's more clear than sometimes the police even want to admit.
I think they just
I think they have the powers, and then well, I mean, a police officer will often be making a judgment about whether they're going to make the peace worse, as it were, if they act. But I mean, you know. The truth is, I completely agree with what you just said about this is not helping the cause. But I also understand. I have kids in schools in the Rhondda who say to me the thing that they worry most about in their lifetime is climate change. And so
disputing that. No one's disputing the idea of a protest. It's about the way that they're doing it.
Well, it is slightly the point.
But does that justify that?
No, of course it doesn't justify that action. But I think we have to. You know, every time the government steps back from its commitments on climate change, for instance, by telling the King Charles that he can't go to COP27, I think it just makes people more desperate, more angry, and I want us to tackle climate change because I think it's the single biggest danger to humanity.
The topic is not the issue. People should not have their lives disrupted by self-appointed demonstrators who think they have a God-given right to glue themselves to tarmac and prevent people from going to work, ambulances, getting through businesses, getting on with their business.
How would you tackle it?
There are many, many ways of protesting, demonstrating freely, without violence, without disruption, that are far more effective than the counterproductive measures that they are bringing in. So why did you not support the measures in the bill which would have made it even easier for police to deal with it?
Because I don't think they do that. I think they make it more difficult for the police to do their job.
Have more powers, but the frustration of me and my constituents is that the police seem more concerned at times with giving them water and asking about their welfare than moving them out of the way and letting people get on with their lives. And that's where people are really frustrated.
I mean, do you think that's true, Sonia? I mean, Liz Truss has said in her conference speech, I will make sure that militant activists such as Extinction Rebellion, separate to this particular group, are not able to disrupt ordinary people who work hard and do the right thing and go into work. If you think they're not doing their cause any good, do you think there'll be more public sympathy for toughening up the law on this?
Possibly, but I think I'm not sure that the issue is the law. I think it's genuinely very difficult when you've got people coming and gluing themselves, like gluing their hands to things. That's something that's quite difficult for the police to deal with. And actually, we have seen the police sort of use different tactics. So I've heard, for example, you know, this week, the police were spraying a special substance onto these to sort of melt the glue and remove the protesters. But these aren't easy things. And I think it's wrong for the Prime Minister to suggest that there's a very simple legal lever that can be pulled. I think we should, as a society, be saying to people, this isn't the way to protest, though. You know.
I mean, well, what do you say in response to Sonia?
Well, I think other countries look on and think, are we mad, where we just don't remove them. And I'm not saying we should be violent towards them, but actually we've got to send out a message that this is completely unacceptable. These are the ways you can make your point. We are a free society. We have free speech here, and you can make it much more effectively. This is not the way of doing it. And the priority of the police must be to make sure that members of the public can go about their daily lives and business. And if there's anybody standing in the way of that, then they need to be dealt with. And the penalties...
There's no answer.
The penalties
There's no
need
answer.
to be considerable.
There's no answer.
If I were to go and demonstrate and create myself as a just stop the oil protesters, I would probably get removed rather more forcibly than this lot are. That's not right. It's double standard.
Yeah, is it
I do think
said
you need
nothing,
to be
Tim.
careful about giving police indiscriminate powers, and that's because actually we've seen cases where the police have overstepped the mark and interfered with people's
Not asking
free
for indiscriminate
speech.
powers. Using common
the police
sense
are
is
actually
what we're asking
quite bad
to do.
at making some of these judgment calls.
Final word,
sometimes.
Natasha, on this to you.
Yeah, no, good arguments on all sides, to be fair. But you know, what's completely clear is that the current system isn't working. Whatever's happening, it's not working right now. But at the end of the day, I think these guys, the Just Stop All process, are not going to stop, no matter what laws are in place. You know, they should be looking at exactly how they can do it in any way possible, to be fair.
All right, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much to all of my guests today. There'll be more Politics Live tomorrow at 11:15 on BBC Two and on BBC iPlayer. It will, of course, be Prime Minister's Questions, the second for Liz Truss, a bit like her cabinet meeting. So make sure you tune in and watch the programme then. Bye-bye.